Hello and welcome to episode 15 of Autistic FM. My name is Haje, I use he, him pronouns, and I'm your host on this journey. You can subscribe to Autistic FM wherever you get your podcasts, and seriously, please do. Subscribing is one of the most supportive things you can do, whether on your podcasting app, on YouTube, or, wherever you do subscribing things. You can find full transcripts and additional information about each episode on autistic.fm. In this episode of the podcast, I'm joined by Katie, who's been on a lifelong journey trying to figure out what's up with her, through a whole raft of misdiagnoses before finally discovering that she was indeed autistic. Her experiences highlight the challenges autistic women face when their traits do not fill the stereotypical mold, often leading to a long path of misunderstanding and misdiagnosis in the mental health system. Our conversation explores deep into the world of neurodivergence, discussing how the misunderstanding of autism can lead to really complex emotional turmoil, especially for women who are often expected to conform to societal norms that do not accommodate their needs. I do want to add a quick trigger warning. There are a bunch of mentions of emotional distress and mental health struggles, including depressive episodes. Nothing is particularly graphic in this episode, but please do take care of yourself and listen at your own pace. Um, you know what? That's quite enough from me. Let's roll the tape. Dear guest, could you start by sharing your name and your pronouns?
I'm Katie. I'm a she, her.
Awesome. And where in the world are you?
I'm in Sheffield, which is in the north of England.
I am so psyched to have you on the podcast because we've talked back and forth a little bit about some fun topics to cover. But first of all, I'd like to cover are you neurodivergent? And if so, how did you discover that?
Yes, I'm autistic. I don't have ADHD. And I discovered it because my psychiatrist just told me that I'm autistic. He told me that's what he thinks. I didn't think that. I didn't agree with him at first. But he recommended I start the diagnostic process, so I did. And then when I did the big fat questionnaire they gave me, I thought oh yeah, actually I probably just didn't know enough about autism.
What did you why didn't it immediately feel like it fit for you? Like, what was the picture you had of autism before your psychiatrist nudged you in that direction?
I guess I had the same picture that a lot of people have. I thought it was the sort of stereotype of the autistic boy.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is such a common trope out in the world. And now, does it feel like it fits?
Yeah, definitely 100% like it's responsible for the majority of my problems, I think. And I don't really have... I mean, my psychiatrist before then thought I had all sorts of mental health conditions, but I don't think I have any.
That's extraordinary. Mm-hmm. I feel like that's a disturbingly common story, especially for women.
Yeah.
Are you open to talking about what your previous psychiatrist?
Yeah, I had a few diagnoses actually. So the diagnosis before I got diagnosed with autism was schizoaffective disorder, which is like a hybrid of schizophrenia and bipolar. Before that was bipolar. Before bipolar, it was borderline personality disorder. Before that, it was like anxiety and depression. So they diagnosed me with everything.
I just want to butt in here with an aside, because Katie's story had me going down a rabbit hole with my copy of the DSM, comparing and contrasting the differences and similarities between all of those diagnoses. And look, I'm not a psychiatrist, but I just wanted to share what I found, and I hope that's interesting to you. So overall, autism is a neurodevelopmental condition that mostly affects communication, social interaction, and behavior. And because of those characteristics, especially challenges in things like emotional regulation and difficulties in reading certain social cues, autism can sometimes look like other psychiatric conditions, especially if they involve mood or behavioral shifts. Research indicates that autism is particularly often misdiagnosed as borderline personality disorder, or BPD, in women. But let me go through all three. When it comes to bipolar disorder, one clear overlap is the presence of emotional dysregulation. Autistic folks might experience intense distress or meltdowns, which can sometimes resemble the mood swings seen in bipolar disorder. In both conditions, relationships can be strained because people might find the emotional ups and downs difficult to navigate. One major difference, though, is that bipolar disorder involves distinct episodes of elevated or depressed mood, such as manic or hypomanic phases, whereas autism involves a more consistent patterns of behavior and sensory processing differences from early childhood onwards. Bipolar disorder also tends to emerge later. It's often diagnosed in adolescence or in adulthood, whereas autism is present from an early developmental stage. The comparison between autism and schizoaffective disorder also reveals some really interesting parallels, particularly around social isolation and communication challenges. Individuals who are autistic might prefer to be alone or struggle with social reciprocity, and people with schizoaffective disorder might withdraw, but for a different reason, mostly because of depression or episodes of psychosis. Communication can be affected in both conditions. Like autistic people may have an atypical speech patterns or difficulties with things like back and forth conversation. On the other hand, people with schizoaffective disorder might experience disorganized thinking, and that makes their speech pretty hard to follow. The biggest difference worth being aware of is that schizoaffective disorder is defined partially by psychotic symptoms, things like hallucinations and delusions and disorganized thinking, in addition to various mood disturbances. Whereas autism does not inherently involve these types of psychoses. Autism also shows hallmark developmental signs much earlier in life, while schizoaffective disorder tends to be diagnosed much later, typically around late adolescence or early adulthoods. Now, when it comes to borderline personality disorder, or BPD, at first glance it might seem pretty similar to autism because of the emotional instability and interpersonal difficulties that can impair in both. Now, autistic individuals often struggle with regulating emotions and reading social cues, which can lead to misunderstandings and conflicts. People with BPD also have difficulties with emotional regulation, and their relationships can be volatile, marked by intense fear of abandonment or alternating between things like idealizing and then devaluing others. Despite of these surface similarities, the root causes and diagnostic criteria are actually quite different. Autism is neurodevelopmental, meaning that it arises from differences in brain development, and that often manifests early in childhood, as I said. BPD, on the other hand, is a personality disorder, and that's a completely different thing. It's characterized by pervasive patterns of instability in self image, in mood, in relationships, and it's typically diagnosed much later in adulthood. While an autistic person might have trouble grasping social norms due to processing differences, somebody with BPD often struggles with a deep fear of abandonment and an unstable kind of sense of self. Given the similarities, it is easy to see how autism might be mistaken for bipolar disorder, schizoaffective disorder, or even borderline personality disorder, especially if the professionals are looking primarily at the outward signs of emotional distress, or social withdrawal, or communication difficulties. Things like emotional meltdowns or stress responses in autism could also be misread as a manic episode, psychosis, or features of another personality disorder. Now, it gets further complicated, of course, that some autistic folks may experience co occurring mental health conditions, such as anxiety or depression, and that can make things even more complicated. A really thorough evaluation, one that includes detailed developmental history, assessments of core autism features, and close attention to how the various symptoms evolved over time, can make sure that the right diagnosis is made. Now, when autism is properly distinguished from other psychiatric conditions, individuals can receive much more targeted support and interventions, and that causes much better outcomes in daily functioning and things like overall well being. The thing that really frustrates me is that a reason why a lot of people get misdiagnosed is that the professionals are not looking properly, right? They build up an idea and then they lean into things like confirmation bias, where they're like, "Oh, I think you might have BPD," and then if those are all the symptoms you're looking for, it look a lot like BPD. But it's really, really important to listen to the person's internal experience of what's happening. This is one of the reasons that this podcast even exists. I want to help people understand what autism is and what the various differences are. Anyway, that was a long aside. Thank you for sticking with me. Let's get back to Katie and our interview.
So by the time they said, we think you might be autistic, I was kind of like, okay, diagnosed with everything at this point. So this is
Right.
just like,
Here we go again kind of thing.
yeah, like, obviously you think I'm a freak, just tell me. But then I looked into it a bit more, and I saw that for autistic women, it's very common to be diagnosed with pretty much every single disease under the sun mentally before you get your autism diagnosis. So
Yeah.
it was quite vindicating, because a lot of people had said, that I'm just completely crazy.
What brand of completely crazy? And did that kind of feel like it made sense for you? It's like, because you just rattled off a whole bunch of pretty serious diagnoses, and it sounds like maybe they didn't quite fit, or did I feel like it didn't quite fit?
They felt like they fit at the time. Like, I genuinely believed I had bipolar. I was an advocate for bipolar people. To me, it made a lot of sense, because I do have periods where I'm not very active. Well, I'm saying that's kind of an understatement. During periods of burnout, which I was getting very badly, autism can look like a depressive episode. But because I wasn't consistently depressed, and I was having times where I was really busy, really creative, very active, especially socially, they didn't see it as like, oh, you're doing loads of socializing which you can't cope with, and that's burning you out, which of course now I know. And I do superhuman things because I'm autistic, and they recognize the superhumanness, and that confused them. I know it's like kind of a cheesy thing to say, but it is true. A lot of the things that I do, neurotypical people can't do, and I'm sure that you identify with that as well. So they made that a morbidity, instead of a talent.
Yeah. How does that land on you? How does that feel?
Like, I just don't care anymore. I really don't. I think I'm kind of used to, like, I'm 38, and when I was growing up, like, girls didn't really have like aspirations to do things like be on podcasts and stuff. We were just, I had the options of being like a hairdresser or a nurse, and that's kind of the only aspirations that I had for myself. So when I started to do things that were really cool, I didn't feel like underappreciated or underrecognized, or people think it's weird that I can do this. I just thought, like, of course I'm going to be not appreciated. That makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. And you mentioned you didn't use the word superpowers. What was the word you used? Sorry.
Like superhuman.
Yeah. Could you share some of those things that you've noticed where you are, where you're perceiving yourself as being pretty different from others?
I guess work-wise, I can just sit and focus on a task for an entire day and night. I can just get completely absorbed in it and do really good work. And I was using that advantageously for my career, doing really well in my career. And my psychiatrist really couldn't understand why I was kind of abnormally successful for my age, but was also having these like serious mental health issues. And I think they bipolar people are special. A lot of them are extremely talented, and they can be very productive during a manic period, some of them. So that's kind of like what they were blaming that on. They didn't really see hyper productivity or hyper focus as a normal thing that people should be doing, and they kind of discouraged me from doing it. So when I was hyper focused on something, I'd see that as kind of like, I'm not very well at the moment, when really that's just who I am.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Out there in the world, are you noticing other people who are going through a series of diagnoses before they settled on autism?
I made a lot of friends when I was in the mental health system, and I think the majority of my friends have been diagnosed with autism now, instead of a mental health issue.
Yeah.
I think it's quite normal, because I think it's normal for us to seek help for the things that we're bothered with, and we don't tend to go to a psychiatrist and tell them about the things in our life that are going well, and maybe even ham it up a bit, so we're getting the help that we need. We don't tell them everything, and they're not getting a complete picture. So I would recommend to psychiatrists and mental health workers that they're asking about the kind of things that people enjoy, and not just the bad stuff, because I think it would have been easier for them to pull the picture together that I'm autistic, because if you know me, it's obvious that I'm autistic. Like, I'm quite stereotypically autistic,
Yeah. When you say stereotypically autistic, can you give some examples of things you do or experience?
I'm just the kind of person, like, when I play a game, I will do every single side quest, and play through every single version. And I know that most people don't do that. I know, so, like, a lot of people do it who are neurotypical, but I think most people who do stuff like that are neurodivergent. Um, and the kind of shows that we like to watch and the sense of humour that we have is all quite similar. And I know it's an undocumented, unexplored thing, but I've always got along with autistic people quite well because I love Pokemon and stuff like that. So, I meet some autistic man who everyone thinks is a freak because he's like an adult man who wants to talk about Pokemon, and I'm like, actually, I can talk about that as well. Like, that's cool to me,
Yeah.
When you're a woman, no one expects it.
Do you think being a woman was part of the reason why your psychiatrist struggled to diagnose you? They just didn't think to look?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think it would have ever occurred to them. And I don't really blame them for that because, I mean, they say autism looks different in women than men. I don't know how true that is. I think it's less different than we're told. But I personally didn't really know that women could get autism. I just didn't.
Yeah.
Especially growing up.
Right. Yeah. I hear you saying that you don't blame them, but I kind of blame them. It's your fucking job to not misdiagnose people, right? And I appreciate it's a hard thing to do, but I'm not going to get angry on your behalf. You can get angry for yourself if that's true for you. But for me, I find it like really disrespectful to not have a full picture of the conditions you're meant to be diagnosing.
Yeah, I think it's more of like a woman problem than an autism problem. And it's not the top of my priorities for women problems,
Right.
As a little girl, you're right, you're supposed to be this like quiet, well-behaved, demure girl, and autistic girls often fall into that really easily. And we don't kick off about not being given the food that we want, like an autistic little boy may or may not. Well, like, I've got an autistic little boy and he's really well-behaved. But the stereotype is there that autistic little boys, they're naughty and they're having meltdowns a lot and stuff, and things like shutdowns are less recognised. But I think when I was a kid, like, I can see how I would have been gone unnoticed. But when I was about 15, I completely lost it and started acting out quite badly. Wouldn't do anything I was supposed to do, wouldn't do anything I was told. And I'm really glad that I actually found the voice to kick off about stuff and express myself. But I made it pretty clear, like, I'm not going to fit in with people. I don't want to. I don't want to be part of society at all. And that's when I got the mental health diagnosis, because obviously that's crazy to people, right? You're supposed to want certain things.
What kind of stuff were you starting to kick off about?
Just like my family, my parents, my school, all of it just made me furiously angry. And I don't really I don't blame myself at all. To me, it's very reasonable, because you've probably heard what British comprehensive schools are like. It's crazy, the kind of level of shit that I had to go through. And you get it from your teachers as well. Like, my teachers were awful. And not in the way that they'd be unreasonable to me, in the way that they'd shout at me and stuff. But I talk about it a bit on my TikTok, just always letting people pick teams in PE. So every 3 times a week, I'm having to be picked last in PE, and the teacher's just watching that happen. I'm having to be like a punishment as someone to sit next to, and I've put up with all of that for years and years and years. And then I got to a point where it's just like, people around me are dicks, and I'm not going to deal with that. I'm not just going to be like this nice, quiet person anymore.
Yeah.
So I wouldn't say I was rebellious, but I was just a bitch to everyone, to be honest.
Do you have a sense where that was coming from? Was your cup just running over and you're like, I'm fucking done with this? Or was it more of was this a response to some sort of overstimulation type situation? Or I'm trying to figure out what was really the tipping point for you.
I think I was burnt out and also had just started to develop my own adult identity. That was when I started listening to different kind of music and reading adult books and questioning things a bit more. And I think a lot of kids go through that kind of like angry punk phase, you know, where they start questioning the system. And I think as an autistic person, there's a lot more to question.
Yeah. What was the thing that you ended up questioning?
I think all of it, just all of it, just the day-to-day stuff for me felt not, I don't want to say oppressive, but suppressive of who I am. And I was kind of sick of being called weird and all the rest of it. And then obviously when you become that person and you become a really rebellious person and you stop doing what you're told, teenagers think that's really cool. So I ended up making like a bunch of friends, you know, and having a bunch of drama with that. And it kind of worked out in my favor, I suppose, because I see, you know, a lot of autistic women, but also neurotypical women as well. They might get to their midlife and think, shit, I've never advocated for myself. I've never just been who I am. I've never said this isn't working for me, you know. So men will say when something isn't working for them a lot more freely, I believe. But it's a good thing to do.
Yeah, no, I agree. So if somebody's listening to this and is like, hey, I feel like I'm a little trapped by whatever you feel trapped by, I suppose, do you have a piece of advice? Like where would you, like what would you wish that you could tell the 12-year-old Katie?
A lot of people won't be okay with who you are, and a lot of people will tell you, you know, we've got centuries of histrionic labels to deal with and get past, but that doesn't really matter. You don't actually need to fit in and be a part of society, I don't think. And people, I know neurotypical people think it's the worst thing in the world to be not socially accepted and to be unpopular and be all the rest of it, but it's really not.
I agree totally. And it sounds like you do have a lot of the trimmings of a life that many people would consider normal. You mentioned you had a kid, you mentioned you had a husband. And like, do those things feel like milestones for you in the pursuit of normalcy?
Yeah, you know, I live like I live a pretty conservative life. Like I wanted to be married before I had children, so I did all that. I run a successful business. My husband's quite successful. We've got a nice big house. Like everything's going really well for me. And I feel like it's kind of proof that doing things my way has worked out. It's worked out just fine. And there's loads of people who are in exactly my situation, but they feel trapped in that situation. Whereas I don't. I feel like it's something I've built. I'm very comfortable. I like a quiet, peaceful lifestyle. Middle class suburbia is the perfect place for autistic people because every day is the same. It's very peaceful. It's very calm.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. What is the business you're doing?
I run a little social media PR thing.
Oh, cool. Super cool. And I presume that means that you have a lot of flexibility over when you work, how much you work, where you work.
Yeah, it's really good.
Yeah, totally. I think that's the thing that I hear a lot of people feel really trapped with. It's like especially if you're struggling to manage your energy, like if you run out of energy halfway through the workday, like how the hell are you even going to commute home kind of thing. I was commuting by public transport for a while, and public transport here in San Francisco, it's quite special. it's not clean. It's got a lot of people who have pretty severe mental health issues. And so just navigating that was exhausting and kind of a little bit scary, especially if I'm completely out of spoons. And so now that I'm working from home, like the last few jobs I have were like companies I started myself. And I usually refer to myself as unemployable, right? Because I feel like I don't like the trappings of having a job are, now that I'm starting to unmask more, it sounds completely unbearable to me.
Yeah, I couldn't do it. And I'm unemployable. I've never been able to hold down a job. I've never been able to, well, before I was working and doing well, I was just unemployed. Like I was on disability benefits.
Yeah.
And I thought that might be it, but I was still dabbling in a lot of things, and I ended up being able to make money from that. I think there's always ways to make money, and you can make more than you expect.
Yeah, totally.
Mm.
Where are you at now with you mentioned at some point in the past that you had been an advocate for bipolar folks, and then discovered that maybe that label didn't fully apply to you. What was that journey like?
It was mind blowing because it was a label that I was attached to. I had a lot of bipolar friends. I love bipolar people. I love schizophrenic people as well. I think they're just like all neurodivergent people are just some of the coolest people you'll ever meet, and they're really great. They're really misunderstood by society. I don't really regret being a part of that. I do regret being an advocate for something that I actually wasn't, because I feel like I've put a lot of misinformation out there, and I have no desire to be an advocate for autism, especially the kind of arguments the autistic community have is so boring. I find it so boring. Just watch.
Would you say more?
Oh man, like, just no. On my TikTok, someone will always comment like, "Oh, you shouldn't say neurotypical people. You should say holistic people. You shouldn't say this. You should say that." I hate that shit.
Right. Yeah, it feels like a lot of drama.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's an interesting piece there about kind of tone policing and what language you use, right? I mean, you like so far in this interview, you've used the word crazy a bunch of times, and you get to use that word, right? I mean, you have had a number of diagnoses that people kind of equate with crazy, and so you get to claim that word if you want that word. I would never call you crazy, right? That feels rude. But I feel there's this narrative that we get to weave about the language we use about ourselves, and when you're talking about the people who are not us, it becomes interesting, right? Is it neurotypical? Is it allistic? Is it like, what words do we choose to use? And I think words have so much power, but the thing is, a lot of this is literal cultural imperialism, right? A lot of this language is all coming out of the US, and like the UK has a different set of words for a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
For better or for worse.
And everything is like, it's very, very different in the UK, and generationally as well. Like, I'm sort of more on the cusp of Gen X, where people were a lot more liberal about what they say and the words that they use. It feels quite restrictive now, and I don't really like that. But I do understand that as someone who is speaking about autism, I am an advocate of some sorts, and I do have a responsibility to represent the autistic community in a fair way.
Right.
But also, I just really like making fun of neurotypical people too much. I'm sorry.
What do you enjoy about that?
It's just like, they just blow my mind. Honestly, they really blow my mind. And I talk about it with neurotypical people as well, and I think they find it quite freeing, because I think they see being neurotypical and that culture as quite trapping, you know. I don't feel that way about the autistic community or autistic culture. I find it very liberating and freeing to speak to other autistic people. But I don't think neurotypical people always feel like that way about each other.
Interesting. When it comes to subcultures in general, right, you have the kind of the sexual subcultures, like where, you know, coming out as gay is a really big moment in a queer person's life. And I feel like talking about mental health, and maybe in particular in the UK, is so taboo and so weird that by the time you're actually out there publicly identifying, you've kind of put yourself into a group of people, you self-selected into a subculture, right? And I feel like if you are the default, the status quo, as a neurotypical person, you don't have to make that choice.
I mean, I find the queer community to just be like, even if they're neurotypical, I find them freeing people to talk to, because you're kind of giving permission for people to be themselves, right? And I feel like maybe some neurotypical people also feel that way about autistic people. They know they can kind of drop certain things and be a little bit more experimental. In the same way you might feel a bit more comfortable, like being a little bit more fruity around someone who's comfortable with gayness, you know? I don't know,
Yeah,
maybe.
no, I think that is right. And I think honestly, what it boils down to is acceptance.
Mm,
Acceptance of yourself, acceptance of other, being okay with being different than the dominant culture.
yeah. I don't think anyone's really happy with the dominant culture.
Well, maybe. My perception is that the people who are happy with dominant culture are the people who benefit from dominant culture.
Mm,
And like I've been away from the UK for long enough that I don't really have a solid sense of what dominant culture is. I left pre-Brexit,
mm,
and from over this side of the pond, I was like, "What is going on?" And I don't have to get into Brexit or not, but I'm saying there's a lot of things that have changed in the past 5 or 6 years in the UK, politically and culturally. And the same is true here, right? I really didn't see a second Trump presidency coming. That is just absolutely bonkers to me.
yeah, I mean, the UK definitely feels fully fascist. Definitely.
Yeah. Is that showing up in your day-to-day life in any way?
I mean, everything's really boring here now, and you know, people from England are funny, at least to other English people. Like, there's a lot of humour and messing around, teasing each other, banter, and to achieve that, you really have like a level of safeness with other people where you can say whatever you want, no matter how off the chain it is. And
Yeah.
that's kind of going, like, people are getting more serious, particularly young people. I've got stepkids and stuff. I know a lot of young people and they're very, very serious. It just doesn't feel right.
Yeah. Yeah. Does that feel restrictive in a way that you kind of like, would you say more? I'm curious what that feels like.
I don't know. It's hard to put my finger on, but it's just, I don't know. I don't know if it's the internet. I don't know if it's global. I don't know if it's the UK. It's just very drab here. And for example, like, I know fascist people have a big problem with like the arts, you know, and they want to defund certain university courses. And that's all happening now. And the culture of the UK is going, like, we're not getting, it just doesn't feel like there's as much stuff coming out of it as it used to be, like creatively and musically and all the rest of it. I know there are some cool artists in the UK at the moment, but if you look at what they've built their style on compared to what the other people did before them, it's just nowhere near as innovative.
What fuels your creativity?
I'm a very self-disciplined, motivated person. I think my creativity, I think I just like things to look nice, you know, and just be nice. Mm-hmm. That's it. What about you?
I feel like a lot of my creativity is kind of fueled by injustice. It's like things that make me angry. I'm like, well, I can sit here and be angry, or I can try and channel that towards something. And so that's kind of where a lot of my kind of, the troublemaker in me wants to cause the kind of trouble that facilitates change.
Yeah, I feel like that as well. That's like the kind of thing that's spooking me about the moment, though, because times are pretty hard at the moment. And usually in hard times, you get a surge of creativity, like all the beautiful music that came with slavery period, you know, and like the German like punk movement from the Stasi stuff. I don't know much about that. But usually you get like a really like soulful backlash of art and culture, and it doesn't feel like that's happening. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Do you have any thoughts about why?
Maybe there's less collaboration. Like maybe people just aren't hanging out with each other as more. It's easier to start a band or something if you're just like bored and have nothing to do. Now there's always something to do, isn't there? I sound like 100 years old now. Like, this is where my
get off my lawn.
Yeah, but that's what we used to do. Like when we were kids, we just used to hang out. We were really bored, hanging out in the streets, doing nonsense, and you don't really see that as much now.
Yeah, my curiosity is it's the old thing about bread and circus, right? As long as the people are kept occupied, they don't rebel. And for better or for worse, like I'm going to speak for myself. I am super addicted to dopamine at this point, right? So scrolling on TikTok and Instagram and whatnot, it's like that feels a lot less stressful than starting a revolution. You know what I'm saying?
I
Yeah.
feel you on that. It's definitely like I think I'm lucky that I'm old enough to remember life before the internet and social media, because I didn't have the internet on my smartphone until I was about 22, 23. And when
Yeah.
I was a teenager, a lot of the time you're just staring at a wall or something, or just doing absolutely nothing. And I don't do that really anymore. Like if I've got a spare 5 minutes, I'm bored. Even I'm brushing my teeth, I'm just like, oh, I'll just check TikTok or something.
Do you miss it?
Yeah, I try and do it more. I started going to bed like without my phone and stuff. I know it's like, I know people go on about like old people hating phones and smartphones and stuff, but it's definitely like a really noticeable thing, do you think?
Yeah, no, I don't think it's good for us. I really don't think it's good for us on a number of different levels. And the scariest thing to me is the algorithm is so good at showing you information you like
Yeah.
that it's almost impossible to find other points of view, right? The bubble that just reaffirms your worldview. And I think in particular for people with mental health challenges, that is brutal, because suddenly now every signal you get confirms what you already thought, even though what you thought may be complete bogus.
Yeah. I think some pretty like wacky stuff like this. It's all there like affirming me on TikTok. Some
Right.
really out there stuff. I kind of enjoy it though.
Right. But I think there's this universe where you're kind of being able to look at this objectively as like that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a universe where I've definitely been in states where I'm feeling not entirely well balanced.
Mm-hmm.
And then suddenly those kind of like, yeah, I feel sometimes I'm like, hey, I've got to put my phone down or I'm going to have a full-on psychotic break. I will lose touch with reality because something about what this phone is telling me doesn't feel right, but I can't put my finger on what it is.
Yeah. It's hard as well when you're autistic though, because a lot of people don't really get much human interaction in real life. And I think sometimes as a TikToker, you're kind of playing a role as somebody's friend in a way.
Right.
Like you're not really their friend, but they may not be seeing that many people that day.
Right.
And I know a lot of my followers, they don't really get to see many people. They don't get to go out. A lot of them don't have jobs. So
yeah.
And I enjoy it because I don't really go out and talk to people and see people that much either.
Right.
I get isolated very, very easily. So I do see like some kind of value in it. And I guess it can stop you from seeking out real life human interactions, but that's not something that I've ever really sought out, even pre-internet. Do you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
I find it too stressful.
What is stressful about it to you? Like, how does that show up for you if you have to wander out into the world?
I just assume that I'm going to be perceived very badly because a lot of people do get offended easily by me and just what I'm doing. I don't really think it's anything that I say. Like I try and be polite, but and also there's like a lack of trust for me with people because I personally am very, very against like duality in a person and putting on a front, and I hate that. I can't really tolerate it. If I find someone's been pretending to like me, to me that's like absolutely traumatic. And people have said on my TikTok that if I feel like that, I've not had a hard enough life to find that traumatic. But I genuinely do, like above everything else, like to find out someone's just been faking it with me the whole time is like just something weird to me. Because I would never do that. I can't do that. And I don't like it even if someone says, oh, I didn't really like you at first, like I wasn't sure about you at first, but you've really grown on me now. I just think, why are you friends with me?
I have had several incredibly big and deep friendships with people over the internet that I never ended up meeting. And that was kind of before the current generation of like on news groups and forums and all that kind of stuff back in the day. And now, like TikTok, it feels like a lot of the friends are a lot more disposable, but at the same time, it feels, and I guess in particular because the algorithm, like I follow you, you follow me, even if I follow you, I don't see all of your content, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the algorithm only shows me your content that it thinks I am going to enjoy,
Yeah.
which means that I don't have a full 3-dimensional picture of Katie.
Yeah.
Like if you share something that you're struggling with or that you're curious about or whatnot, and the algorithm is like, Haje doesn't care about that. Maybe it's right, but at the same time, it means that I have a very specific sliver of Katie experience, which I don't know.
Yeah, that's a part of friendship, isn't it? Is listening to the boring parts.
Yeah. And I'm curious, if there wasn't social media and there wasn't internet, would I be spending a lot more time out in the world? I don't think so.
Yeah, I don't.
Maybe my brain would finally let me read books again.
Yeah.
Basically.
I also had like the internet friends on the forums and things like that, and all that kind of nonsense. I think it's become like more important, the aesthetics of something. You know, if somebody's got an interesting looking room or costume or something like that.
Do you have sensory challenges as part of your autistic? Would you say a little bit more about what that is and how that shows up for you?
This was one of the reasons I didn't realise I was autistic, because I have undersensitivity in a lot of areas, which I didn't know even was a thing. I didn't know autistic people could be undersensitive. So I love lifting weights and sort of the pain you get afterwards from it. Spicy food, super sour food. Like, when I realised that autistic people would stim with food, I was just like, my entire life makes sense, because I will eat entire jars of pickle and drink the juice. I will have like ridiculously spicy curries, and everyone always comments on it. You know, everyone thinks that's weird about me. So not only do I have these like mental health issues, but there's also other things I do that people are saying weird, like pre-diagnosis, like that. Now I heard that autistic people find loud noises painful. And I loved clubbing. You know, when I was a kid, I loved going to clubs and dancing and concerts and things like that.
I'm actually starting to get to know myself a little bit more and know when I'm overstimulated that I have certain needs, when I'm understimulated I have other needs. And sometimes I just don't even know. I'm just feeling like universal discomfort. And in those days, I'm like, I am probably going to have a meltdown. I don't know what to do with myself at this point. I've been overstimulated. I've been overpeopled. You know, even sitting in my kind of safe place is usually my bathtub with like just a salt lamp. So it's like dark in there. And so the very steady stimulation of water is helpful. But then at the same time, it's like, even this feels like it's too much or too little or both at the same time. And it's just like, it becomes so unpleasant to be in my body.
Yeah. It was crazy to me how much my mental health issues disappeared when I started doing sensory therapy and making sure the right sense, like meeting my sensory needs every day. And it feels like we can't go so weird and be so depressed or want to like harm ourselves just because of overstimulation. But that totally can happen. And I think managing that for me has been the biggest part of just being able to live my life.
And you mentioned going to the gym, right? Like a good workout. Like, you're going to feel that in your body. But again, it's something you can control. And I think for a lot of us, being able to control our environment, like you can choose to go to the gym and then you can choose how hard you want to go. If you want to chill out a little bit, do like many reps with light weights, that's cool. Or if you pick up some heavy weights and go, you know what, I'm going to go to my breaking point. That's a very different experience, but that's an experience you can choose.
And going to your breaking point with weights is autistic as hell. Like, it's such an autistic thing. Loads of the gym bros are autistic. It's on the questionnaire, the autism questionnaire in the UK, is if you like weights. Yeah, it's a sign. So, anyone's listening.
I didn't know that.
Yep.
That is hilarious. Yeah, and it's interesting too, because I do like going hard. I'm not a great runner, but I run a 5K a couple of times a month. And then, you know, when the finish line is in sight, I was like, I will run as hard as I possibly can. And ideally, I will be at the point of almost fainting by the time I make it to the finish line. because I know that my heart is just going nuts, my entire body is going crazy, and hopefully it's cool enough that my sweat just evaporates very quickly because I can't stand the feeling of like that stickiness. It's horrible. Yeah. Is there any part of you that looks back at some of the other diagnoses you had and was like, this this sensory piece doesn't make sense in the context of those?
It didn't. Well, some bipolar people do experience sensory issues, a high percentage. It's not a part of bipolar, but it is a comorbid thing. I think that's because there's so many people misdiagnosed. I don't think we have any real data about bipolar at this point, but I just didn't even know I had sensory issues. I really didn't know.
Right.
I thought I couldn't put two and two together in my mind, like, oh, this is because of this. I think,
well, and the crazy thing is, of course, you don't know what other people are experiencing.
No.
Right?
I think a good sign of autism is just, I think I've always been aware I'm enjoying this shit more than other people are, you know? Like, just more into something. It's a more intense experience for you. And people might think it's uncool, or they might think it's weird, or they're making comments about it. They're just finding you strange. The things that you like to do and the things that you are into.
Well, and the depth you get into them, right?
Yeah, the depth.
What are some of your like special interests or things that you love just spending time with?
I wouldn't say I love it, but I'm very interested in ancient history and paleontology and just everything that came before. I wish I didn't care. Like, I wish I could just not bother at all because it's such a waste of time. But that really interests me and excites me a lot.
Why do you think it's a waste of time?
I can see the value of people wanting to understand, I don't know, like kind of Roman politics and systems and things so that we can understand our system or whatever. But honestly, the shit I'm into is so obscure. No one really needs to know about it. Genuinely, no one needs to know about it. I think anthropology is very interesting because I think it's a really nice way of looking at I'm just interested in people, I guess.
Yeah.
You know? It can shape how you live your life now, but really, there's probably certain things about history we need to know, but a lot of it we don't.
Yeah.
And we don't know a lot of it.
Can I try something and just say something to you, and then you can sit with that and tell me how that lands?
Yeah, okay, go.
From what you just said, you said that what you were doing isn't valuable or isn't useful. And my curiosity is, why does it have to be? That feels like a very kind of capitalist forward way of thinking about things. Couldn't it have value just because you enjoy it? Like, isn't that the value to you personally?
Yeah, you know what? That's just tapped on something that is like just a part of my personality. I think like just me as a business owner, I am a person who wants things to be like productive all the time and has... But I am basically just like a human algorithm of trying to make things work better and be more successful. And it frustrates me that I have that part of me which is just like, you know what, this is just really interesting and I can't stop learning about it.
The reason I'm challenging you is that I'm challenging myself on the exact same thing at the moment. Like, this podcast is a great example. Clearly, this is one of my special interests, right? And am I making money? No. Am I ever going to make money? Fuck knows. But it's like my long-term plan is to write a book, right? And maybe the book will sell well and maybe I will make money that way. But for the next 2 years, this is a labor of love and curiosity. And if I thought that this had no value, like because it doesn't make money, then I think this would be really hard to do.
Yeah.
And so I'm giving myself permission to say, hey, I don't know. Like, there's a few hundred people who listen to this podcast. I have no way of knowing. But I think there's something about like giving ourselves permission to enjoy what we enjoy. And especially, as you say, if your enjoyment is like, holy shit, I feel like most holistic people, their enjoyment level is a 7. And I'm over here reading about Roman history and I'm like bouncing in my chair with excitement.
Yeah.
Awesome. Why not?
You know what? I don't find it that enjoyable. I have to say, I really don't. And a lot of the time, it just pisses me off. Like, I get so triggered, like literally triggered every time I read one of my kids' books and it has dinosaurs without feathers in it. I'm just like, no. We know all dinosaurs with feathers. There's not a wild theory that they turned into birds. Dinosaurs aren't extinct. Like, they live on the earth still.
Right.
I get so mad about it. And I wish
you want to meet a dinosaur? Let's go look at a chicken.
Yeah. Why can't we just say whatever made up shit that... Okay, you got me on something here. The thing with dinosaurs, it's a really big example of how in our culture and society, something needs to be accepted by most people before it's considered true. It doesn't matter if it's a fact or if an expert knows it. If most people don't agree with that, it's not true.
Yep. Well, and I think this is one of the real shortcomings of being in a heteronormative, mostly white culture that's mostly driven by men. I don't think it's healthy, or I don't think it's helpful. Because it means we leave out so much. There's so many other lived experiences that we don't get to experience. And there's so much wisdom that we are ignoring because it doesn't fit into the very neat, this is what's taught in a university. And I don't get me wrong, I believe in science, but I also believe that there's a lot of stuff science can't explain. And ignoring those things because science can't explain it feels like that's not how science is meant to work, right?
I mean, even things that are just scientifically known and are taught in university, physics is another really good example. The kind of things that physics know about, I tell my mum about, and she just thinks I've been smoking weed, It's like, this is actually true, this is not.
Do you have an example? What kind of thing?
I'm very interested in like astrophysics and atomic physics and particle physics and all that kind of physics. And a lot of reality and matter isn't really like what we think it is. It's not how it seems, And if I try and explain that to her, she's just like, this is, where are you getting this from?
Right.
But that's a good example, I think. And this is physics hundreds of years old.
Yeah, totally. Quantum physics makes me very happy. Like when I try to read and my brain just kind of makes this weird creaking noise where I'm like, oh, this does not fit with anything I know.
No, like I read a biography. It's like a best-selling, it was on the Booker Prize shortlist, but just about people like Schrodinger and Heisenberg. They're really, really weird, and they would absolutely be given like mental health diagnoses today, for sure.
Yeah, totally.
Not even Tesla, like really big ones,
Right.
So I found that learning about those mind-bending ways of thinking and understanding where that comes from also made me feel a lot more comfortable in my neurodiversity. Like, it's actually not that bad. It's definitely not a bad part of humanity.
Hey, I promised I would try and keep this under an hour, and I see that we're about to hit an hour. So I've got a couple of questions that I like to ask people at the end. I'd like to do that.
Okay.
What do you wish allistic people understood about autism?
That I think it's a classic, but it's a good one, that autistic people are trying their best all the time. They are trying so hard to do what they're supposed to do, say what they're supposed to say, and act how they're supposed to act. And they need to be given more grace socially, because I've never met an autistic person. I've met autistic people I don't get along with, but I've never met one who I think is genuinely like is an angel at heart, So just give us some grace. That's it.
Yeah. Oh God, that hits so hard. I met somebody in the supermarket the other day. I had to go and do something, and they were acting weird, and they were being annoying, and they were like, and I was like, for fuck's sake, like, why are you even here? And as I was thinking that to myself, I wouldn't dare to say that out loud, of course. But as I was thinking that to myself, I was like, oh, wait a minute. This person may very well be neurodivergent, and I am not giving them the grace they deserve.
There's so much fear. I think that's one of the hardest things about being an autistic man, probably, is that if someone in the supermarket is stood too close to me, I interpret that as aggression, whereas they could just be autistic.
Right. Goodness, I was visiting my sister once, and she lived in Australia, so I'd been traveling for like 20 hours, and I was feeling like overwhelmed, sweaty, too warm, and there was this guy who was just like in the queue for immigration, was just kind of rubbing against my back. He was so close, and I turned around. I was like, "Hey, could I haven't showered. I don't feel super great. Could you just give me a little bit of space?" 3 seconds later, he was like against me again. And I turned around a second time. I was like, hey, do you mind? So I put my suitcase behind me just to have a little bit of space. And the third time, I just snapped. I turned around. I was like, I told you twice. I won't tell you again. I'll fucking deck you. Give me some space. Like, totally inappropriate, right? And so security came over, pulled me out of line. I was like, what was going on? I was like, I'm so sorry, but I just can't people right now. And this guy was just rubbing against the back of me, and I just lost it. I'm really sorry. And the security guy took a look at me and was like, you're having a hard day, aren't you? I was like, yes, I really am. And he escorted me to the front of the line, let me through, and just sent me on my way. And I was like, okay, well, that is the most beautiful way. That's what I thought. It was like the most beautiful way that could have gone. Another way this could have gone was like, hey, you threatened violence to somebody in an airport. And I think you're right. I think sometimes just losing it can look really scary and dangerous.
Yeah. As women, it's considered hysterical. As men,
Right.
and particularly men of colour, right? You have a meltdown in public. That's like, whoa. I mean, personally, if I see a man like crying in public and I don't understand why he's crying, like for me, that's quite scary.
Yeah, it would be.
Mm.
It would be. Men are unpredictable.
You know, so they can be like physically harmful. So but
yeah,
autistic people kind of do have meltdowns in public, and should probably treat people with maybe a little less caution.
It's just one of those things. The other question I would love to ask you is, can you tell me a story of when you felt particularly seen and loved in exactly the right way for you?
I get a lot of that from my kids and my husband, more than anybody else. Like I didn't really find it from like my parents growing up, or from really any friends. Like I do have friends, but I don't really feel that from them, I guess. But yeah, from my kids, like they just see you for who you are, I think.
And what do they do in specific that makes you go, oh, they really understand me?
I think they just see I think a mother always sees her children as like the sort of light that you have when you're newborn and you've come like from heaven, you know. And when a baby smiles for the first time, it's like magical. And then you always see that in your children. Like I always see that in my children, no matter what. And I think they kind of see it in me as well, you know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's beautiful.
Yeah, it's nice to have that kind of like fresh start with someone.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, how many kids do you have? And how old are they?
Got an autistic
one
and a neurotypical one. The autistic one's 7 and a 4-year-old.
My girlfriend has a 4-year-old, and so I'm spending a lot of time around him. And like the size of his love, the size of his emotions, it's like a lot of the time I find myself just being envious. Like I wish I could just fully get it out. Like if I'm upset, you cry, and then 10 minutes later you're completely 100% fine again because there was like a safety valve. He doesn't carry that around with him. And I'm like, I can learn something from this creature.
Definitely. It helps to let it out, right?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Totally. Katie, I really appreciate you coming on the podcast. I thought it was a really beautiful episode. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm sad it's over, actually. I had fun.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the podcast. You can find us on TikTok on Autistic FM, on Instagram at autistic_FM, and on the web on autistic.fm. On our website, you can also find a link to our newsletter, which I send out whenever we do a new episode, with some additional resources and news from across the world of neurospiciness. This podcast is produced and hosted by me, Haje. If you know anybody who would be a great guest on the podcast, don't hesitate to get in touch. You can email us on hello@autistic.fm or reach out via the socials. See you very soon.